Welcome everyone to this discussion on Maria Rashid's Tour de Force, Militarism and Affect and the Politics of Sacrifice in the Pakistan Army. Before we turn to the book, I want to thank everyone at the LLF and particularly Iman for her support. So Maria Rashid's book is an ethnography in a study of Chakwal, located in a historical recruiting ground for the British colonial Indian Army and the post-colonial Pakistani Army. While the book's focus is intensely local, it is a critical intervention in analyzing the allure of militarism and in understanding how states and armies deploy what she calls affective technologies to build and strengthen a consensual, unquestionable appeal of martyrdom and militarism in the service of the nation or indeed a cause. Seemingly then, the book is about Pakistani militarized masculinity, and to some extent it is. However, in a deft, nuanced, and sensitive weaving of ethnographic data with emotional depth, Maria brings gendered Pakistani subjectivity to life. As she speaks to the women of Chakwal, mothers and wives, she communicates with their hearts and minds and dismantles the Cartesian cogito, the mind and body split. She brings her reader in proximity with mourning widows and mothers, in an affective space where notions of sacrifice and martyrdom in service of the nation confront the quotidian reality of life without a husband and the death of a beloved son in a man's world. The feminist perspective is not merely a thread running through Dying to Serve, but the ethnographic research and analysis are profoundly imbricated in a feminist understanding and worldview. And this is why we reached out to Maria and Rubina Sehgal and Aisha Khan, the two feminist scholars who are to join us today. So welcome, Maria, and welcome to Rubina and Aisha. So I think to people who are familiar with Pakistan studies, Rubina doesn't need an introduction. She's a sort of go-to person if you're trying to understand subjectivity in Pakistan, feminist subjectivity in Pakistan. An independent scholar based in Lahore. She's former country director of Action Aid Pakistan, and she's published widely. So it's difficult to go through everything that she's written on education, nationalism, the state, ethnicity, militarization, radicalism, terrorism, and human rights. But I would say that two of her books, which are rather better known perhaps than her very large corpus to non-specialists, is the Pakistan Project of Feminine Perspective on Nation and Identity and Knowledge and Identity, Articulation of Gender in Educational Discourse in Pakistan. So our second discussant is Aisha Khan, a researcher based at the Collective for Social Science Research in Karachi. And her much needed book, The Women's Movement in Pakistan, Activism, Islam and Democracy, was published in 2018. And currently Aisha is at the Institute for Development Studies in the UK, researching the increased political participation of women and gender equality policies in Pakistan. So here is how we agreed to proceed with this discussion. First, Maria will introduce her book to the audience. This will be followed by Rubina Sehgal, and who will speak for 15 minutes. I should have said Maria will speak for 10, and Aisha will follow Rubina with 15 minutes, and then Maria will respond to them before we open the session to the audience for questions. So without further ado, welcome Maria, welcome Rubina, welcome Aisha, and over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for those very, very wonderful words. And let me first start by officially thanking the Lahore Literature Festival for arranging this session and for allowing me really to be in conversation with these wonderful women activists and scholars, Nasreen Rahman, Aisha Khan, and Rubina Sehgal, whose scholarship I have admired, I have learned from. And in the case of Rubina, I think who has directly really influenced my own work on militarism and affect and much of what the book is about. So this really is a very exciting opportunity for me to talk to them and to really see them engaging with what I have to say and to understand, you know, how this is being understood and to really perhaps discover new ways of looking at this conversation. So what I'd like to take up, talk a little bit about in this initial period where I'm trying to, I thought it would be useful to really introduce the book itself, its primary argument, and why and how the book really engages with gender, which is kind of the focus of this particular book talk. And I'd like to begin by talking about, a little bit about why or I wrote the book or what led me to write this book. And I think that's always interesting for people, and at least that's a question that I'm nearly always asked. So I thought, maybe we could perhaps get that out of the way before I proceed into the more drier, perhaps, content. So as is the case with most books, I think personal biographies of authors, their experiences and their politics intrudes upon the landscape or the social world that they choose to discuss or talk about or investigate. And I situate myself as both an insider and an outsider within the subject of this book. I come from a military family, and clearly this subject position affords me a familiarity with what what I'm trying to study. It allows me an intimacy with scripts of military. It allows me a kind of exposure, which I think only if you're immersed within these kinds of spaces, you get. And this pride and service and sacrifice is a narrative that I very much grew up with. And then in 2012, some of you may recall that there was an avalanche in the Siachen Glacier. And this was around the time that I was planning to do my PhD. And so in this avalanche, about 140 soldiers, close to 140 soldiers, within minutes, we lost them. And I remember at that point being struck, of course, by the immense tragedy, but also being struck with how the discussion at that point was, or at least not so much about the futility of soldier deployment in a terrain which is inhospitable to life. Instead of that kind of discussion, I remember being amazed and very intrigued by how we were instead inundated with images of very brave soldiers, stoic and suffering and sacrificing mothers who were seemingly willing to not just give up 1, but 10 soldiers if needed by the nation state. So in that moment, I remember being very intrigued by it and also sort of very curious as to what is it that compels these grieving families to stand complicitly within these commemorative narratives when they've suffered such immense and such terrible loss. So what does this investment in grief and sacrifice really tell us about how modern militarism operates? And that's something that got me thinking, and then of course now and then has led to the book itself. So very briefly, the book is a study of the mechanics that allow the military to access and take up political space. An access that I argue depends in part on the military's ability to produce certain kinds of political and certain kinds of affective subjects. The ways in which it creates an image of itself as an institution that demands reverence and respect. So in some ways, the book is not so much about how the military interferes in politics or about civil-military imbalance, which has been the subject of a lot of scholarship when it comes to the military in Pakistan. And I'm not suggesting that that's not important, but this is a different book. This is a book about how the military creates a certain kind of politics. And this is something I sort of repeat in all my book talks. So, but I think it's essential for me to just put it out there that the book really is about the study of relationships that are crafted within militarism, Foremost, it is an examination of the affective relationships that exist between the institution of the military and its soldiers and their families, and then how do these bonds act then as conduits for the military's relationship with the larger citizenry, or in fashioning the appeal of militarism in everyday life. And the book, as Nasreen Appa mentioned, is based on my research in Punjab, in the district of Chakwal. And those of you who are familiar with colonial history will be aware of how, would know that Chakwal was a famed martial district. Much of the Muslim soldier in World War I and II was drawn from these martial belts. And so my book is based on an ethnography in villages in Chakwal and also at commemorative ceremonies and training and recruitment centers of the military itself. So based on interviews, in-depth interviews and ethnography in these areas. The book is organized just very quickly for those who would like to pick it up. So you have an idea what the book actually, what the substance of the book is. It's organized into ethnographic scenarios that follow these relationships through a variety of critical moments and areas. So I talk about the grand spectacles of mourning that the military hosts. I talk about local terrains or the village spaces where the bulk of the army's soldier class has been drawn. And I do a historical reading of colonial British Indian Army policies of recruitment and also the post-colonial trajectory of Pakistan Army's recruitment politics in these areas. And important to point out that I look at the soldier class within this book. I'm not studying the military officer class. So the NCOs and the JCOs or the enlisted personnel of the military are the subject of this particular book. I look at disciplinary regimes of training that manufacture the soldier subject. I look at also rural spaces where military funerals are held and practices of grieving and mourning that unfold within these spaces, and also compensation regimes that are rolled out at the time of military death. I also look at disablement in war and the politics of representation of the disabled or the maimed body in military representations. And I also look at religion and specifically contestations around religion with respect to the war on terror, how that unfolds within local spaces and in the making of the soldier and training institutes. So the primary argument of the book is that affect, emotion, passions are centrally implicated in militarism and are used as a technology of rule. And it's a mechanism through which the military makes us subjects and maintains its hegemony over state and society. And in this book, I talk about how this affect is produced, how it is regulated, and how the military is concerned with not just its absence, but also its excess. So it needs to produce certain kinds of affect, and it also needs to then control and maintain and discipline that affect. I also talk about ambivalences. I talk about the afterlife of affect. What happens? Is there room for subversion? Is there room for challenge to these narratives within subjects of the military? And I'll speak to this more later, perhaps as the discussion progresses. But briefly, very quickly, I'd like to come to the question of gender, which is, as Nasreen Appa spoke about, is something that runs through the book. And that was a conscious choice not to limit it to a chapter talking about wives and mothers, but how, really and try and understand how their lives, and not just women's lives, but men's lives through regimes of gender, how are they implicated within militarism? And so women's indispensability to war is something that feminist scholarship has talked about. For example, gender imaginaries and the notions of the masculine soldier who protects the wife, the women and the home and the nation are central to the notion of war, right? So women are indispensable as in material ways in terms of producers of sons who go and fight, or as providers of gendered labor within homes of soldiers, which allow these soldiers to go into service. And also they're used symbolically to legitimize wars, right? So the book is very much about these women whose sons and husbands die in uniform and their lived experiences and the way they are pulled into the politics of service and sacrifice. And so it looks at the relationship of the military with these wives and mothers at different points in time. And I talk specifically, I think one key focus within this is the grief of these women, right? And how that is treated differently at different points in time. So within commemorative ceremonies of the military, the female subject's affect and grief is desired and it's deliberately invoked. because the military sees her ability to express grief and then to invoke it in others as very vital for these spectacles of mourning that we see. So you have the Azim Ma who comes onto the stage and in very controlled but very, very moving ways expresses grief. And so, but in the rural space, we see a very different treatment of grief by the military, where the military's attempt is to really contain and discipline it. So very raw grief and private grief is managed through military procedures and protocols. And so the book tries to trace how militarism extends outside the institution to relationships and subjects that have not really signed up for duty, and like the soldier, but how militarism is then reproduced and reconfigured through the lives and the bodies of these women. And I'll end now by reading a Vain, which is a Punjabi morning ritual, which is, it's in the book as well, in which, in these rituals, for those not familiar with how these Vains are conducted, these are elegies which convey pain and loss and anger, and often are held when, at the time of death in these villages. And these Vains are discouraged by the military in case of a military funeral, but they do happen in the private space of the village when the military is not present or once the military has left. And this particular Vain that I'll recite now is by Sajida, whose son died in Vana about 6 months ago. At the time that I went in for my fieldwork, 6 months had passed since his death. And this was her second youngest son, and she recited this as we sat at her son's grave. And Sajda's husband had died young and left her with 6 children to look after. She had farmed her small land holdings and also worked as a laborer in other people's fields for much of her life. It's in Punjabi, and in this she speaks about how she toiled in the field during his infancy at a time when she was also breastfeeding him. So it's in Punjabi. I will unfortunately only read it out in English, but its key refrain is, when I cry, then I ask. Jab main rondiya te main akhniya. And this is something that keeps coming up. So she says, when I cry, then I ask. You were a child looked after by God. My child, I would wake up at dawn to grind wheat. You would be lying asleep, and I would grind wheat, and then I would leave. Sometimes for karsal, sometimes for pindi. Sometimes I would leave you in the room inside. Sometimes I would throw you on the cot outside. You were a child looked after by God. When dusk approached, I would feed the cattle or pick peanuts from the field, or I would cut sugarcane. And when I returned in the evening, only then would I feed you the milk I had. You should have died then. I would have forgotten you by now. Why did you not die then? When I cry, then I ask, Jab main rondiya te main akhniya. Why did you not die then? So I'll end here, and I look forward to other people's discussions, questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for that very succinct and introduction to the book, and for ending with that very moving bang. I will now invite Rubina Sehgal, Dr. Rubina Sehgal, to discuss the book with us.
You need to unmute, Rubina.
Okay, I'd like to start by thanking you, Nasreen, and the Lahore Literary Festival for inviting me to share my thoughts about this really wonderful, wonderful book, one of the best that I have read in the last many, many years. And I'd like to start by saying that although there have been a lot of accounts of militarism and militarization, most of them have been political and economic, like Dr. Aisha Siddiqa or Ahmad Hussain, or Hassan Bardezi or Tariq Ali. They have been basically based on the politics and economy of the army and its interference in civilian affairs. The feminist work, a little bit that has been done by Sabah Khattak, by Najma Sadek, and by myself, well, it's just either chapters or articles, not really a complete work like this. This is the first work that is much more focused on the social and cultural aspects of the relationship between the military and society, and how that relationship is organized, ordered, manipulated, and disciplined. So it's the first ethnographic, detailed, thorough account of how the military engenders the kind of legitimacy and the kind of consent which makes the nation and the country and people not only love it but willing to sacrifice all our resources for, because most people think it's only through coercion and the fear of the military that we are obedient to it, that we're afraid of it, and we conform to its projects. But Maria has shown so clearly and so succinctly and beautifully in this book that it is not just fear and the domination coercion. We directly are participants in the project of militarism because of the affect which is used as she says, a technique of governmentality, using the Foucauldian perspective of how affect is produces and is consistently reproduced, and which enables the military to justify its civilian interference in civilian affairs and its hegemony in Pakistan. So it's the first anthropological study, ethnographic study that I have seen of this kind. And I must say that throughout, while reading the book, I've already confessed this to this group, but I would like to say that it is one of the books that is unique in that books either appeal to the intellect or to the heart, to feelings. But this book constantly appeals to the intellect as well as to the heart. There were many parts in the book where if I was reading about how a parent expressed their loss, I was reduced to tears. I wept. And even when I read this van that Maria has just read out, I wept because there is so much emotion. So this book not only makes you think intellectually and of course it appeals to the intellect, it also goes to the heart. It is so well written. I guess it is Maria's style that impressed me so much about this book. It's not just purely rational. It goes so much to the heart. And Maria basically shows how affect is harnessed, deployed, produced, and manipulated through the discourses of nation, religion, family, and kin. And she makes this whole affect includes, passions and feelings and emotions and all of that. And the way she has shown that it's not just interior, it's not just inside the person. The affect is also social. It also emerges in the interactions with people. So it doesn't just have interiority, it is also external. And the army achieves the hegemony that it does in our society by tying this affect between the state and citizens through the narratives of protecting and defending the country, the homeland, the nation, the larger family, which is known as the nation, the larger kinship. And she talks a lot about these spectacles. We've had spectacles of the 1965 war, 6 September, for a long time since 65. We've had spectacles of 14th August, the display of guns and the display of our biggest missiles and the display of tanks and bombs on national days, which is like the rituals of the nation state that are carried out. But Maria talks particularly about the Yom-e-Shuhada and the Yom-e-Difa post 2015, because in 2015, as she mentions in the book and as we were talking about the other day also, that the whole notion of Shaheed was thrown up into question. There was a big debate in Pakistan about whether in the war on terror the Shaheed is the person killed or the person who's killing. Whether the soldier is a Shaheed or whether Hakimullah Mahsood, who was declared a terrorist, just like recently, even Imran Khan said it in the assembly that Osama bin Laden was a Shaheed. So this whole expansion of the notion of martyr to different people, like for example, we were talking about the MQM struggle and Nafisa Shah's excellent paper on how those who died fighting for the MQM Muhajir cause were also defined as Shaheeds, and the mothers were known as Shaheed ki Ma, and the widow was Shaheed ki Beva, and all that, and how this very, very emotive concept has taken on national political connotations, how it is used and deployed. And she describes the Yom-e-Shuhada very beautifully, how it is a thoroughly, minutely curated and thoroughly choreographed event in which the families of the Shuhada are sitting, the Chief of Army Staff makes a presentation, and the camera, the TV, it moves very strategically to show somebody crying in the audience, somebody crying on stage, one of the people, they are paraded on the stage, and how it is the grief there is partly, of course, authentic, real. I mean, they're real people, loved ones have died, but partly how it is also choreographed and curated and controlled, meaning you can express just so much grief, but not more. You should not look weak, and you should look like you willingly surrendered your son or your loved one. But it should be appropriate so that the nation sees how much the military is giving up for us to protect us, and therefore it has a right to all our resources that we otherwise resent it for. So she describes in great detail and very interestingly the whole ceremony, the whole spectacle of mourning and grief, in which grief is used and this affect is used to harness people, the immediate families, and then the larger nation to the project of militarism and war and death. And the larger nation is brought in this way. And in a sense, it also helps to civilianize the military space. Usually we talk of militarization of civil space, how they have encroached upon civilian spheres. And Maria shows very effectively how when the chief of army staff makes a speech, he makes references to the economy and to governance and to things that are not military, at least in the constitution, but that allows them to encroach upon these spheres in a way that ultimately ties the people to them. And we say, okay, you know, all our resources are there for you, everything. You are giving up your lives. Look how much you're giving up. Therefore, you know, you have a right on the loyalty and love of this nation because of all that you are. So the whole sacrifice, the idea of the trope of sacrifice is used to basically create this love, this passion, which is produced, managed, disciplined, and distributed. Of course, Maria also talks about the class divide, where the soldiers from the poor families, from the peasant class, from Chakwal, are seated in one place, the richer families in another, and how there is also, but that I can't go into detail because of the time here, because basically these spectacles bring out a kind of a gendered masculinity and femininity, in which both the grieving mother and the son who has given his life are basically supposed to suppress a part of their femininity. It is the feminine that has to be downplayed or underplayed or ignored, and the masculine has to be brought out. The soldier is the masculine soldier who's willing to fight and die for his motherland. And the grieving mother, while she's also shown as a figure of grief and mourning because she's lost a dear one in the war, but she's also at the same time, she can't be too feminine. She has to express the strong, stoic, sacrificing side, that she's a sort of a masculinized mother because she's doing something so brave. So throughout the discourse, you see that masculinity is really upheld, while femininity is denigrated and considered lesser, and that is where where gender comes in to this whole book. Of course, there is the difference between the wife and mother that Maria talks about, how the wife is a little bit more of a confusing figure because she is still a sexual person and she can still marry, and therefore in compensation regimes it becomes there's politics over who should get the compensation, how much should the wife get, and if she's married again, and you know, but the mother is this asexual, this completely pure woman who has just given her son to the land. And for the soldier, all his original attachments have to be sort of diminished in favor of the new attachments. For example, his attachments to the home, family, and mother. The home is now the unit in which he is in the family, in the regiment or whatever. The mother is now the motherland, and the family is the nation, the larger kinship. How his attachments have to be taken away from the tangible, real ones to the nation, the country, the motherland, and the army. And so there is an inflection of both masculinity and femininity in a way in which masculinity is prioritized over femininity, and feminine sides are important, are there because they have to, that affect has to be used in the process of the production of the nation and the production of the military and the production of the soldier. But the feminine side has to be kept at a lesser level. So this is how gender is reproduced. And then, of course, there is this constant subversion and this constant interruption, interrogation of the discourse, which is then, of course, also managed and disciplined. Because there are moments when somebody is doubtful, somebody questions. For example, the soldier who says that he knows he has become an automaton. He has become a mechanical figure who's doing things mechanically somewhere, and his finer emotions have been somehow, diminished. And then the mother who says, just as in the van, the mother who says wish he had died as a baby when he was still small, after having grown up and become, when God was his only protector because he was out all day working. And then when the father who just can't get over his son's loss says that if he had another son, he would have to give up son. So in between those protestations of I would give 10 sons to the military and I would give, there are these moments of interruption, moments of interrogation, moments of subversion. But then the whole discourse of dying for the country, for religion, for home, for family, for kinship, actually helps them then tie themselves back to the militarist project, because basically that project and those grand narratives are used so that when there are these interruptions and subversions, and when there is guilt in the family, for example, for having lost a son, because basically a lot of the families join because they need the money economically, they need the money and the land and the privileges, the pakki naukri, guaranteed job, guaranteed income. And that is what they have actually lost the son for, because that is a reality. Thousands of people waiting to join the army, it's because it's a guaranteed job with benefits. And so the guilt and the ambivalence that the families feel over surrendering their son, or offering their son up for sacrifice, is then overcome by even a stronger attachment to the state, the military, and all. As Maria says, that that's all the more reiterated, that attachment, so that it becomes a justification. Okay, we've given up our most precious relation, but then we are saving the country, the nation, kinship, etc. And I suspect that if there were more private conversations with those people who said, I would give up 10 sons, or I would sacrifice even another son if there were more of these private conversations by any of us, there would be more of the crying, the breaking down, the sorrow, loss, and grief would come out much more. But they are trained to sort of not express it that much, simply because, this is a project that they feel they have to serve. So basically, what happens is that the economic need to join the military is sort of effaced by this showing of, and this whole compensation regime also for the military is kind of underplayed and downplayed, because when a civilian law enforcement officer dies, a policeman or something, the compensation is announced and people know how much money was given to the family. It's on TV all the time. We gave 3 lakhs or 5 lakhs to the family. But in the military case, these are hidden because of the whole theme of patriotism, that he died fighting for country, religion, motherland, kinship, family. And therefore, it's not about money. Even though one of the mothers says, कि फौज ने तो हमें बिल्कुल वो बना दिया है पैसों का, हमें पैसों में तोड़ दिया है फौज ने कि money. And the mother who's looking around for her son and who says, we have a home and we have a house and we have money, पर पुत्र नहीं मिलता. I can't find my son. Yes, we got a home and we got money, but lost the son. So they deal with this grief, this ambivalence, through these grand narratives of religion, country, service to the motherland, and that is how they justify. So I would end by saying that it is one of the most important, and as I said, beautifully written books that I have read in recent years, and so important because it just moves away from the usual narratives of, military interfering in politics, military trying to bring in governments and take out governments, and military taking too many of our resources, and it goes to the heart of the matter, how affect is produced and used as a technique of governmentality in order to produce this consent, because it is not coercion, it is consent for the domination of the military in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina, for that very insightful and moving reading of the book, and which I think is the hallmark of the best feminist scholarship that's coming out of Pakistan. So thank you very much for that. And I'll now turn to welcome Aisha Khan. Aisha, we look forward to hearing what you have to say about this wonderful book. and very important book.
Thank you, Nasreen, and thank you also to the organizers of LLF for organizing this panel and giving us a chance to share our views on what I agree with Rubina as one of the most important and beautiful books to come out from the Pakistani scholarship tradition in recent years. I read the book once, but I feel that it needs to be read many times.
Yeah.
It is a text of political sociology, but it is also foundational to the feminist enterprise because it helps us to unpack our understanding of hegemonic masculinity in what I would suggest is its most perverted institution, the military. The book, so therefore, it deserves multiple readings to allow us to really consider its full implications for how do we want to resituate the military as an institution, as a social construct, a driver of religion and ideology, and to question what is its true relationship with the citizens of this country. As I said, I think it is beautifully written, it's sensitive, nuanced, and in its engagement with the production of affect in service of the military, it also produces deep affect, deep and conflicting emotions in the reader as we gain insight into the grief of parents who have lost a child in battle, and even disbelief as we see them struggle to come to terms with the knowledge that they will nonetheless give up more such children to this tragic enterprise. I think the book stands alongside another magnificent PhD thesis, which was Nafisa Shah's book on the political economy and the social institution of honor killings. This book, as Nafisa's is another extraordinary feminist contribution to scholarship on Pakistan that deconstructs another social institution. Maria's book is a major contribution, I think, to our intellectual thought, our critical discourse, which is sorely lacking in the public domain, which is why I feel it's so wonderful that the LLF has organized this panel. I have come up with a few discussion questions that maybe would be great if Maria could respond to. I'll just sort of run through them now. First is that, Maria, you argue in the book that the Battle of Islams was one of the main reasons that Pakistani soldiers expressed reluctance to engage in anti-Taliban conflict, in contrast to their engagement against fellow countrymen in 1971 or in Balochistan. And then further insight comes from another observation in the book that locals in Chakwal saw the Taliban enemy as misguided Muslims, although fellow travelers on the Islamic journey, but they were misguided, whereas the Islam from that the military espouses is the more correct one. So in order to enable their killing of Taliban, they used notions of the Taliban belonging to tribal parts of the country to use colonial era categories, as you point out. And this helped to explain their actions, as ethnic difference in other military operations have also been used to otherize and render more primitive non-Punjabi enemies. At the same time, you describe early in the book how recruitment is such a meticulous science, which has increased in recent years to expand beyond the traditional parts of Punjab from which soldiers have been recruited since the colonial era. So in other words, if the military is trying to expand its base beyond Punjab and recruit from different parts of the country, how will this affect its otherizing project? Will it complicate the othering that is necessary to fight its current battles on multiple fronts with fellow citizens? So my second question, that was the first one. My next point has to do with the material compensation, which Rubina was just explaining in detail, which grieving families recognize without value, but yet they do demand it and they do expect it when they are faced with disability or, of course, the death of a son. So there's an economy of loss that continues with colonial tradition, in which the emoluments go to the mother or the widow of the dead soldier, which is interesting because here, the woman, as Rubina had mentioned, is a primitive subordinate to be managed by the military, but yet she becomes a visible political subject in the process, as you point out, Maria, who needs to engage with the state and its institutions as she negotiates for the pension and other supports available to her as a mother or wife of a shaheed. So the attention and policies keep her invested and complicit in the militarist project. You also point out how her role in the family and community changes as she becomes an asset that they would like to retain. For example, leading to a widow being pressured to marry the brother of her deceased husband rather than return to her parental home, taking the financial gains from his death with her to that household. So this is a very important and kind of, it's a knot here, the positionality of this woman, but yet she's so important to the success of this project. So I'm wondering what your views are if we take this a point further and ask ourselves, is this a point of opportunity for feminist reform or intervention? We have looked at the military as an institution, we've critiqued it on so many levels, and I'm wondering whether this work that you've done, this insight into the woman's location in this political economy of loss is grounds for us to work on and maybe think about as feminists and as we work in Pakistan as activists. My last question has to do with the manufacture of a soldier and how, of course, you've beautifully explained how it's tied to the management of emotion, and the amplification of hate is hate of the others, such as Hindus, and the love, and contrasting with the hate is love of the nation state, in which the military and fellow soldiers are viewed as an extended family whose honor and pride we are willing to die for. And it is honor, interestingly enough, that locks this family together, which is, of course, to the detriment of women. The desire of a soldier to serve and die is achieved through affective regulation, as you've discussed, involving the production of love. And this necessitates a harsh break with home to allow room to form new bonds of attachment to the new military family, and disassociation, as we have already discussed, from all that is feminine and weak. Soldiers, in fact, do speak of dissociation, a splitting of the self as they recall their indoctrination and training upon joining the military. But despite what a soldier goes on to do in the line of duty, he has a lingering awareness, as you describe, of what he has lost in the process of his training. While I was reading this, I thought to myself that your characterization of the military as producers of soldiers who are in effect traumatized boys, these makers of dissociated selves to be turned into killers, is very powerful. It makes the military's political ambitions appear not only unconstitutional, as we all know, but dangerous for the psyche of the citizens. What do you think are the political implications of these findings? So I think I can close here. I'm not sure. I think we might be running out of time. If you do have time in your comments, Maria, to just add any insights you might have to the final question that I had, which is about how the ideology of Shahada produces compliance with the military endeavor and combined with material benefits to families of soldiers. But do you think that the role of religion in crafting this fantasy ideology differentiates our military from that of other countries, like in the US, for example? Because a similar crafting of affect is required, I think, in all military projects, and what makes ours perhaps different from other countries?
Can I add my question also so that Maria can deal with all the questions together?
Rubina, just 1 minute. I'd just like to tell the audience that we've actually got an hour and a half. So at after an hour, we still have another half an hour for questions. So sorry, Rubina, for interrupting there, but I just wanted to let the audience know.
Yeah, so I'll add my question to the ones that Aisha has raised. I know that you argue, and quite rightly, that basically economic necessity and the need for a stable income is actually one of the push factors for going into the military. It's the economy, and they need a guaranteed income, etc. But they have to, everything has to be covered up with some kind of a justifying ideology based on something larger and bigger. I was thinking, yes, this probably is a very big motivation because a lot of these people in that area are poor and they're peasants. But is there also something else going here? Because I was thinking of my reading on fascism and on Nazism, particularly written by the Frankfurt School, where Erich Fromm particularly argues that the reason that the German nation, so people surrendered themselves so totally to the state, glorified the state as the something a greater, bigger, great good, to which they sacrificed it, because every human being feels so small and so insignificant and so powerless vis-a-vis these large institutions, that by participation in the statist project of fascism, they felt bigger, they felt part of something larger. It's like, when a soldier carries a gun, he comes from a powerless family, he has no power otherwise in life, has no money, he's a poor person, but carrying the gun, riding on a tank, or flying in a jet fighter, or it somehow makes them feel stronger and bigger. So is it something perhaps a little more than, of course, the economic benefit of joining the army?
Can I go ahead? Can I proceed? Yes. Okay. So thank you for your reading and your sort of analysis of the book. And once again, I mean, I think it's always wonderful to hear other people talk about your book, because in some ways it gives you a different sort of understanding of how people are perceiving it. And in so many ways, Rubina, what you said was a brilliant summary of what I was trying to really say. And it's very useful to hear some other person talk about it, because then you feel like the crux of the story has been understood in so many ways. And so I really do appreciate what you said. And Aisha, I just want to acknowledge, I think your questions are very thought-provoking. You shared some of this earlier when we were discussing the session, and I was trying to struggle, and sort of think through my responses. And I felt like I wanted to come back and say to you that I may not have responses to everything that you've asked, because I think I've done the analysis. Now, I think some of your questions are about what now? How do we make this more political? How do we move forward on what if we've understood militarism in a new way, or in a different way at least, what is the next, how do you take this forward? So I think much more thought and discussion needs to go into that. So, but I'm still going to try and respond. So, but again, thank you for those questions. And it actually helps me frame, my own way forward in terms of what is really important to take, at least in more political work, what is important to take forward beyond scholarship and beyond research. So your first question, Aisha, was around this idea of do we the fact that the military now is setting itself up and wants to be a nationally integrated army, does that in any way hamper its ability to then wage war or carry out operations against groups of people who might now be within the army also, right? So what does this do to this whole game of othering? And if I were to really, in a very uncomplicated way, respond to that question, and nothing is uncomplicated in real life, but I would say it doesn't. It really doesn't, because I think not in any immediate sense do we get a sense of that the military will be hampered by the fact that the military now has a more integrated workforce. And I say this in time, yes, one will have to watch and see, but my immediate sense is that, one, we need to understand the national policy itself, in the sense that the national policy is for the soldier class. This quota system has been introduced for soldiers only. It's not for military officers. And we know that the military is a highly hierarchical institution where much of the decision-making rests with senior officers, right? So these quotas are for your soldier class. Although it has been concerted effort to recruit officers from across Pakistan as well. So there have been drives within Sindh as well. But yet the actual quotas that say that the Pakistan military will recruit every year based on the male census population are only at this point have been only introduced for the soldier class. So that's an important distinction to understand. So that's where the decision making really does not rest there. Also, these quotas are assessed on domicile. Yeah, so you may have soldiers recruited from Punjab, from Balochistan or Sindh, which have been historically underrepresented in the army, but these could be domicile-based quotas. So they don't have to be ethnic Sindhis or ethnic Balochis who are entering the military. They are technically, could be second-generation Punjabis who have actually settled on these lands because of military allotment of land, right? So, and I'm not saying that there are no ethnic Sindhis or Balochis in the military. I'm just saying at this point, the data that is shared does not show that distinction, that difference. So we don't really know how that works. One would imagine that the military is a generational kind of service where you do have this running through of, you know, baap bhi military mein hai, to beta bhi hai, and so on and so forth. So that's another sort of, so how much is the actual demographic changing? We really don't have that kind of data to say that. And also, as long as the new policy is census based, we know that Punjabis will always dominate the military, right? Because the population of Punjab, male population of Punjab will always be higher than the male population in the provinces. So very, very practically, how much will it actually shift? We have to watch and wait. Although the number, at least, the representation of Punjabis has gone down, but it will always be dominant, right? Because of the way our population is sort of spread in the country. So that's one aspect of it. The second is in terms of, we need to, and I think you pointed that out in both of your analyses, that we need to understand how the military, you know, its formidable ability to exhaustively and meticulously discipline its subjects, right? And to create this Foucauldian idea of docile bodies who will then, you know, follow its commands. So if one kind of, if we need to really understand how meticulously the military trains its soldiers in terms of, you know, regulation of time, space, movement. And as one general said to me during one of the interviews, and I think it's in the book as well, which talks about how, you know, how bravery and chivalry is almost secondary, right? The soldier is drilled in such a way that when he's given the command, he will step out in the line of fire. So whether who is the person standing across from me that he's firing on? Is it the other? Is it the same? You know, it almost at some point becomes redundant. He will step out because he's been drilled that way. Yeah. So and also in terms of training, also I think you referred to this, Aisha, with this, where of course military training is about amplifications of hate, it is about enemy construction, but it is very, very much also about amplification of love for your fellow soldier, love for your family, for your unit, and this idea of developing your association with the military as a kinship group, where, you know, your fellow soldiers are your brothers, and the army is your ma baap, and that's a word soldiers will use. So very much you replace his family with the military unit and the military institution as his family. So those are the drivers that really push people, that will push soldiers to continue to fight with any wars that the military does take up. Yeah. So, and lastly, again, not to overemphasize this point, but it is military is very much a source, is a livelihood. Yeah, for people, and so very much they are driven by those motivators. So at the end, an example of that is the war on terror, where there were contestations, where there were questions of who the enemy is, who is so the son who comes back from battle, has, you know, who has he been fighting? Has he been fighting his Gumrah Bhai, as in misguided brothers, or has he been actually fighting the Kafir enemy? So those questions were very, very much there, but at the same time, it did not in any way hinder recruitment from those areas. So at the time of recruitment every year, there were long lines. So if you see the peak periods where casualties were highest during the war in northwest of Pakistan, you see that the recruitment from Chakwal was actually going up. And that is because agar bahar se nahi mil rahe, to Chakwal or Jhelum se to mil jayenge log, because they will come. So I think, so again, very long response, but what I wanted to say was that I don't see any immediate shift in the military's ability to wage any kind of war that it wants to, because of these you know, mechanisms and how they play out. Okay, so your second question was around the material, I think around the widow and how that plays out. And to expand your question a little bit, Aisha, I think women as political subjects upon the death of the soldier. One is, of course, as beneficiaries that you pointed out, and you traced the ambiguities of that that her becoming that political subject. And the other is, I think, what Rubina spoke about as symbolic resource, yeah, where they're very central to the military's imagery of war. So in both these instances, the instances, the mother or the wife actually become very, are somehow pulled into these narratives of service and sacrifice, and they do become political subjects. And there's this illusion of autonomy almost, like, and what I've tried to show within the book is that in both these moments, they are very much appropriated within a masculinist project. And I think unpacking these moments, understanding them better, are really crucial points of opportunity for feminist intervention in trying to understand why are these women complicit within these narratives, and how can more discussion around actual lived experiences actually, in some ways tell us more about how these very masculinist projects can be dismantled. So in commemorative ceremonies, you have women come up and talk about sacrifice and say, read out very military scripts. And I think it's really critical to understand that it is not just that their grief is being used, and what these narratives do is they make their sacrifice not just meaningful, but they also make the sacrifice desirable, where martyrdom is something that becomes something that we need to aspire to, the nation needs to aspire to. And so this appropriation of women's affect in the service of war, I think, is a very, very, so deconstructing this appropriation for me is a feminist project, and really needs much more deconstruction. Because she really does that. The role of the mother and a sacrificing mother is a very, very is an ideal form of femininity, which is not just limited to war. And so the connections are important, and we have examples of where this kind of refusal for to be appropriated in these narratives can be powerful. So, for example, we have the instance of the APS, the Army Public School, the mothers of the APS, and how they have challenged the state, and they've refused to let their grief be appropriated. In that refusal, they've rejected the state narrative, they've asked for accountability. And I know it's perhaps seems harder when we think about military death, because of course the APS narrative of Shahadat has been questioned because they were children, so it was a different dynamic altogether. But I mean, we have examples from, so we have peace movements or feminist peace movements which have been spearheaded by women who've lost their sons and husbands in war. So there are peace movements in Argentina, there was the Mothers Front in Sri Lanka. So I think mobilizing around this narrative is possible, and questioning this appropriation is possible, and women have done it. They have sort of led that move. Coming back to widows, or which was actually your specific question, so compensation regimes single out the dependent in military policy, and when I went into it, so the policy is affirmative in many ways for women, right? So women will get the emoluments, whether it's the mother or the wife. But how it translates in terms of actual autonomy for the women is a very, very different scenario. And as I think Rubina spoke about, that widows, I think Aisha, you said it, that widows can be then either married off to brothers in the family, or they lose their emoluments. They reported if she chooses to marry of her own accord, then her family, the soldier's family, can report it to the District Armed Services Board in the region, and then her emoluments are taken away. So it would be easy to attribute the failure of these policies to translate into meaningful autonomy for women because of the environment in which these women live. But the failure, and I've argued this in the book, lies in part on the logic of the policy itself. And these policies are largely paternalist, right? Where even when women benefit directly, they single out the woman almost as a dependent, who needs to be taken care of, just as the masculine military has to take care of the weak nation. So, and to be able to qualify for that being taken care of, she has to then be a certain kind of subject, asexual, not transgress certain boundaries. Her suitability as a subject will be determined in terms of how old she is, how many children does she have, does she is there a chance that she may get married again? So, and if that's the case, or if she's very young, then emoluments are divided between the mother and the wife. So all of these considerations will come into play. So these policies, as I started with saying, they're not really affirmative. They're not really women focused, because what they do is they replace family patriarchy with state patriarchy, right? And I think that's important to understand. So I think, again, is this a moment for or something that needs to be can be taken up as a feminist intervention or reform, is something that perhaps we need to talk about more. Okay, so there were lots of questions here. One question that you asked, I think it was Aisha also, about I think that was about yes, it was about this the training of soldiers and the kind of trauma that they face and what that really means, and I think that's, again, we need to understand what is the labor of war? Yeah, what do we expect soldiers to do? And what we expect soldiers to do is live with the expectation of killing and dying, because that's what their job is, right? And so what are the processes that actually go into creating this kind of soldier subject? And I believe we haven't really paid attention to this so much. So we've talked, and scholarship has, for example, looked at PTSD. Yeah, what traumas once a soldier is exposed to the horrors of war, and you see that in the US, and there's lots of research around that. And frankly, that research hasn't happened in Pakistan, so we don't really know so much about that, and the military's doesn't allow you that kind of access also. But I think what's important to understand is that it's not just the horrors of war, it's the preparation for war, which can be also very, very debilitating and very, very destructive for, as you say, the psyche of this young person who's exposed to this training. And what are the costs and what is the toll of that training? Because ultimately you're training him to be able to be willing to inflict violence and also accept violence on his body. So you are training him to be an instrument of violence and also be a willing subject of violence, right? So what does that do to a soldier, irrespective of whether he's exposed to warfare or not? And this is, again, like I said, a spectrum, and needs to be understood as such. And again, more research. We have conscientious objector movements in different countries where soldiers who refuse to serve, or we have combatants who've come back from war and started peace movements. Here we don't have evidence of that. It's hard, but when I interviewed these soldiers, as I think Aisha, you pointed out, they are very aware, and I think Rubina said it also, they're very aware of what the military training has done to them, how it has affected their sense of self, their ability to form relationships, their ability to be comfortable in non-military spaces, and how they sense themselves as different because of what kind of training that they've gone through, and what kind of implications does it have for us when we think about, the psyche of the soldier and what he's expected to do, and again, with this caveat that this is not limited to Pakistan, right? So the soldiers are trained, and the modern military is really a transnational institution. You will find that soldier training is interestingly very, very similar in various, at least the ones that I've read about. And it really resonates with the kind of training the soldier is exposed to here in our space as well. So have I answered everything? I'm not sure. I think I might have missed some questions there. But maybe perhaps if there are other questions that I can respond to, or I think, yeah. Rubina, you said something about economic necessity, and if that is the only, yeah. I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it was more about, the nation state being a larger collective, more powerful collective, and a powerless person, by participating in its projects, feeling bigger. Basically, Eric Fromm's thesis and the whole Frankfurt School idea.
No, but I completely agree, and I feel like that is when I talk about one of the reasons why complicity becomes possible is also because this desire to find make sense of the death and the pain that they face, right? So and that making of the sense comes through exactly what you're saying, this idea of the nation state of playing a part in a bigger project. So I think I sort of I completely agree with that. That is a part of it. That is a huge part of it. I don't think we can look for one driver or one reason that this happens. There are a number of things that come together and make sense.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. I think that this is time now that we can start drawing our audience in. We've got 2 questions, and these questions are from addressed to everyone. So Aisha, Rubina, and Maria. So one question is, which partly, Maria, you've answered: do all militaries deploy these effective technologies, and what makes the Pakistan Army different? And the second question, in fact, is about the construction of womanhood through compensation regimes. So I think that what we'll do is that if the panel can answer and address the first question first, and then we'll turn to the compensation regimes and the construction of womanhood. So Aisha, would you like to go first on the first question? Do all militaries deploy these effective technologies, and what makes the Pakistan Army different?
It's sort of, this question is linked with my last question to Maria also, which is, is it Islam and the use of Islam as the ideology that is driving the creation of the soldier and the part of the narrative within which the technologies of affect are enacted, right? And does that make us in any way different from, for example, the American Army? I was thinking, while I was reading your book about how, remember when former President Trump mocked the family of Pakistani American whose son had died in Iraq, and then there was all this indignation about Gold Star families. So I thought that's their version of the Shahadat narrative, is that they're Gold Star families in America. But I'm wondering, what are your feelings about what are the differences between our army and others?
It's a delicate thing, because I think you want to emphasize that there is a uniqueness to the Pakistan military in terms of, one, of course, the religious frame itself, which is very much there. It's predominant, and which has brought its own challenges over, based on the kind of war you're fighting. So in this particular war on terror, it becomes a problem, whereas in earlier wars, it's been useful. So you want to emphasize that, because that is a feature of how our military operates. But at the same time, I think you don't also want to do a disservice, because, as you say, Aisha, this is something, this idea of the sentiments of the families of the dead, this idea of glorification of the dead in battle, the ideas of the fallen hero, after World War I, the myth of the fallen soldier, the tomb of the unknown soldier. We just finished the 100 years of World War I, and so that there is a glorification narrative that this idea of dying in battle has been glorified, and this is something that all armies, all militaries, all nations is a narrative that they will pull in to justify wars. In Pakistan, of course, because of the nature of the military and how it is positioned in our society, I think, and in our politics, I think it uses this card much more. And it uses this card in very cultural ways, and very, and they obviously come, we experience, they're filtered through the language that, appeals to us and so on. But so again, I think I want to give an answer which says, yes, and also no. Yeah, so it is very much across armies as well, but we have our own flavor of it and we have our own intensity of it, maybe perhaps. So that for me is important. So, but also I just on the religion aspect itself. So where, of course, the Pakistan military uses religion, uses it as it involves, or religion is very much present in when the soldier is trained. I also want to emphasize that it's a very controlled kind of usage of religion. So this project of how much religion the soldier has to be exposed to, how much Islam should he know, is very much, it's navigated very carefully. It's not an exercise. So you have, for example, you have khatib. Since the time of General Zia, you actually started regularizing khatibs into the service. Now, but that doesn't mean that khatibs didn't exist before this. So they were very much they would move from unit to unit. They were just civilians at that point. So what General Zia did was bring them into the military as a regularized part of the force. But what that does is, interestingly, is that your first response is that means the army is getting radicalized and the khatib is now part of the army and therefore, all these soldiers will become extremists. Whereas it has the opposite effect. What it does, it brings the khatib under army hierarchy. So in some ways, the religion is instrumentalized very much, but it's a very controlled instrumentalization. So what he says to the troops now is going to be based upon what the narrative of the army is about what kind of Islam needs to be taught, right? So you have to understand the way it plays out is actually very much. So I see the institution as a very modern institution that uses the religion card and to very effective ways. But it's not something that where religion can run in any direction it wants to, and so that nuance needs to be understood.
Thank you, Maria. So Rubina, we'd like to hear you on this question.
You mean the question of the use of religion or other armies?
Well, how the military deploys the technologies and what makes the Pakistan army different from other armies.
Yeah, I think Maria has already answered that question. That basically, I think a lot of armies do employ religion. I mean, when the Americans go to war, they're always talking of fighting in the name of God and in God we trust, and soldiers' body bags coming in, and the national anthem, and the home of the brave and the home of the free, and it's about God being on our side. Remember that old song?
Yes,
Because
yes.
we had God, we had God on our side by John Baez. So basically, all armies use this, and particularly this whole ideology of patriotism, I think, is used by all the armies. And patriotism has often been called, the refuge of scoundrels. It's the last refuge of the scoundrel. When like Sharif used to say, Pakistan first. Like everything else, I can kill the constitution, kill the people, whatever, because Pakistan first. But I was thinking while you were speaking, Maria, of this interesting aspect of sexuality, because I was reading something a long time ago about the training of the RSS cadres in India. And there, a very big aspect of the training was the suppression of sexual desire, because the idea was that if you express your sexual desire, if you have sex, then energies are lost. Productive and reproductive energies are wasted on activities of pleasure. So therefore, deny yourself, denial of sexuality, like very Gandhian notion, so that your strength remains. You don't lose the seed. But in East Pakistan, which was a very ambivalent war, because everybody knows that in Pakistan there were debates, dinner table debates in every home about whether it was a just war or not, because we were fighting our own people, murdering and killing our own people, raping our own women. But from some of the accounts I've read of that time, which are of course few and far between, there was this somebody wrote about this person in charge who used to say, the general who was there, that of course they're going to rape. I mean, they're far away from home. They don't have access to their women. They don't have access to other pleasures. They are dying for the country. So of course they have to. He used to ask them, how many did you have today? How many did you have for breakfast? How many did you have for dinner? Meaning women. So that sexuality was considered, the outlet was considered necessary for the soldier to be comfortable in fighting. But in the RSS training, you were supposed to suppress these life-giving energies, the libido, in order to keep it, reserve it for the military project. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. It's not directly related to what you're arguing, but it's part of the training in some other countries that you suppress sexual desire.
Mhm. Just
Might
it's,
I ask
sorry.
might I ask a question here? So are you saying that that RSS training has somehow permeated the Indian Army as well, or you're not saying that? I just want a kind of a clarification of that.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't so clear. I wasn't saying that it has penetrated the Indian Army, but since we were discussing in a comparative frame of
Yes.
other armies, how they train their people for the projects of war, and how they are similar in terms of invoking kind of crass patriotism, crass nationalism, and they are sometimes even similar in terms of the whole idea of jihad, holy war. If you kill for religion, you'll go straight to heaven and get the 72 rules and all of that. So that is used to entice the soldier to do that. But and sexuality was sort of openly allowed, to be played out. But in other countries, in some cases of militarist training, and this is not the training of the national Indian military, but it is the training of the RSS cadres. But there's another example of it in one film. I don't remember the name. I think it was Patton or whatever, in a Hollywood film in which they're showing the training of soldiers. The soldiers are constantly repeating. There's a refrain. Uh, this is my penis. This is my gun. This is for fighting. This is for fun. This is my penis. This is my gun. This is for fighting. This is for fun. And they're going around in circles and they're saying this constantly. So this kind of a deep, intimate connection somewhere between fighting and sexuality. I know you talk about masculinity and production of masculinity and femininity very beautifully. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this, how the suppression as well as the outlet of sexuality being part of the whole project of killing and dying.
Um, okay, so before Maria answers that, it sort of ties in with the other question from the audience, which is on the construction of femininity and womanhood through regimes of compensation and other avenues where the panel think that the state is interacting and actually constructing the citizen subject. So Rubina has just asked a question, and I'll sort of give the space now to Maria, but if you could weave in an answer to the question from the audience, because we're also running out of time. And then we'll go to Aisha after Maria. So remember that Aisha
I have
needs
no a lot of time because Rubina has asked me a very difficult question that I, at this point, do not have an immediate answer to. Beyond saying that, because it's not an area that I was able to explore because of my own, constraints in terms of, frankly, my own gender, in terms of what areas they would be willing to talk about in terms of their training. And to be honest, I didn't also probe. So it was so I can't really speak to that in terms of how that, but I think what you point out is very interesting in terms of how sexuality is in the service of, you can't separate it, right? You have to make sense of it within what you are training the soldier to do. So how in one particular instance it becomes a source of celibacy as controlling and becoming stronger, which is a thread that runs through ideas of masculinity also. Sexuality is seen as weakening you, not sexuality, but so you are seen as becoming weaker as you lose your seed and whatever. So that kind of ties into those tropes, and how war allows you to then also feel entitled to other, in the case of the other example you gave. So for the Cynthia In-Law's interesting work on bases that, in terms of when the US Army goes to different parts of the world, there's a whole industry that will come out around it, basically to satisfy and support these troops who are suffering now because they're not home and they have needs and so on. So I think how they play out, but it's very much part and parcel. And what I think the point is important to understand is that it's not going to disappear. It's very much part of how these part of their lives continues to be part of their lives. The kind of manifestation is going to be different based upon how that particular army sees it. Does it see it as a positive thing, or does it control it further to support its own end? So beyond that, I'm not able to comment, Rubina. So sorry about that. Aisha, if you want to add, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, I think, yeah, speak to the question that I think you had mentioned, Nasreen, about other, the state is interacting and what other aid projects are in place where the state is creating citizen subjects. And just with respect to women, for example, we've talked about the political subjectivation of women through this process of receiving emoluments in the military, but it's also, of course, as we see, infantilizing them, right? It's not an empowering way to create a citizen subject because she's a subject by virtue of her dependency. And in fact, her power with the state, and in terms of at least her ability to receive this material gain, will end if she marries again, in the case of a widow, right? So it's not empowering really in any real feminist sense of the word. But for example, we have other projects which are creating, turning a woman into an active citizen subject that are empowering. And for example, the Benazir Income Support Program, which does specifically target women-headed households from very meticulously identified poor households, and then gives them cash in hand, and they then are able to use the cash for what they feel is important. And it also positions them very well with respect to their wider community and extended families as economic bearers of economic rights. And of course, voter registration projects where we have donor agencies, plus we have the government very actively involved in helping people to get CNIC so that they can vote. That is an empowering creation of a citizen subject. So these are definitely, there's a lot of money that goes into that. And I'm just wondering, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, what kind of citizen subject is created through this militarization project? And what is it doing to the people of the country, actually? Whereas you have other programs that we're all so focused on, and we pay so much attention to the successes and failures of, for example, these BISP and voter registration. But do we look at this? And do we not maybe bring this into the conversation and say this is undermining the gains that we are trying to make from these other very politically empowering programs? And yeah, so we can't leave this out of our discussion.
Yes, well, thank you, Aisha, for that. And thank you all three of you for a wonderful discussion on Maria's book, which is an important analysis of the deployment of affect in the service of militarism and the nation. But it's also, as we've heard from Rubina's questions and interventions, and Aisha, that it opens up very important new spaces for analysis of the citizen subject and of nationalism and tropes of subjectivity, in fact, as well, and how these can be molded, and in a very sort of Chomskyan way, how the consensus is created in a kind of a moral authority and a citizen subject. So thank you, ladies, very much. And of course, I think I can plug a feminist perspective, and we can say, that it brings a particular kind of a nuanced link with scholarship and the everyday. And thank you very much for that. And thank you, LLF. Thank you, Iman, again, for being there. And thank you, Maria Rashid. Thank you, Rubina Sehgal. Thank you, Aisha Khan. And thank you, our audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.